In less than a week, over 2,500 of the world's top political, business and media leaders will descend on the Swiss village of Davos in the Alps for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. Themed Resilient Dynamism, this year's forum hopes to spur conversation on how leaders and organizations can master strategic agility and build risk resilience in response to the ongoing global economic uncertainty. Today, we take a special look forward at this year's summit, and joining me for this discussion is Dennis Dykes, is Group Chief Economist at Nedbank. We're also joined by Mila Matola, CEO of Brand South Africa, and joining us from our bureau in Cape Town is Dr. Iqbal Survey. He is CEO of Sekunjalo Investment Group. Gentlemen, welcome. I am hoping for a dynamic conversation, particularly given the fact that this year's main theme at Davos is resilient dynamism. But before we get into it, before we start digging, I want to be provocative and say, is this the right topic to be discussing and trying to capture all of the world's issues that we have seen portrayed through the numbers that we see every day, that Dennis, you particularly analyze on a day-to-day basis? Let me begin with you.
Yeah, I think the background to the theme and what they want to really discuss is that we quite a few years away from the global financial crisis. Obviously, that happened in 2008. We went through a very severe recession. And subsequent to that, we've had periods of optimism, periods of pessimism. We've slipped back into recession in Europe, for example, and elsewhere growth is not looking all that good. And I think what they want to try and actually bring out is, can we bring the confidence back? Can we have more risk-taking by business in particular and get this show on the road once again? So it's a laudable sort of objective. Yeah. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that because there's some background structural factors which make it very, very difficult.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think it's a laudable sort of objective.
Yeah, it does sound to me a little hopeful, more like actually trying to get something going rather than a capture of where the state of the world lies. Mila, from where you stand, are these guys trying to actually maybe get people thinking positively more than perhaps trying to stoke conversation about what ails us as a globe?
Well, Godfrey, I think one can look at it from two perspectives. One is that indeed, yes, there is a need for a little bit more risk-taking coming out of, for some regions of the world, the kind of cautious approach that you have seen. But for other regions of the world, obviously, it is really about saying, how do we respond to the opportunities that present themselves? If you look at Africa, obviously, the context becomes slightly different for most parts of the continent. So I'd say, in effect, the topic and the theme itself is apt, given the current global environment, both economically and if you look also at the geopolitics. What they're essentially saying is, what are response strategies for countries as well as for corporations in this environment where it's no longer business as usual? Yeah. So in many ways, it's almost a catch-all phrase, but that really speaks to issues that each country, each corporation can relate to.
Yeah, let's go to Cape Town. Dr. Survey, us as journalists, our business is to poke and ask questions, sometimes difficult questions. So I ask this question of this resilient dynamism and ask whether it's the appropriate term to be trying to capture the issues that the world is confronted with. From where you stand, is that apt? Is that appropriate? These two gentlemen here are agreeing. I'd like to, hopefully you break away a little bit.
Godfrey, firstly, thanks for having me on the program. And just a slight correction, I'm executive chairman of the Sekunjalo Group, not chief executive. Just a short bit of a correction there. Look, Davos is an interesting place because if you were there post the 2008 financial crises, it was all doom and gloom. And in fact, I think it was one of the shortest Davos meetings for many chief executives and chairmen of corporations. And I guess one has to have a central theme, and I think it is being shaped by what's happening in Europe and North America with the economic crises and the debt crises, and I think that is the key factor. But Davos isn't a place where you're beholden to any particular theme. It's a melting pot of ideas. It's a way of finding different solutions using public sector, governments, lots of key figures from governments all over the world, the private sector, etc. But I think that you come to Davos with your own agenda. And as an African businessman, you know, I go to Davos along with many of my colleagues with a very focused African agenda in order to ensure that the continent continues to get its fair share of attention, of foreign direct investment, and certainly to convey to the other global leaders the very positive developments that are happening on the African continent. So I believe that the next decade is one that the African continent will continue to show significant progress in both socioeconomically, politically, and otherwise. So for us, Davos, yes, there's a central theme, but you know, you shape your participation by your own very clear objectives that you've planned well beforehand.
Yeah, you're going into my next question, because my next question to you was going to be, what's missing for you? Let's begin perhaps at the global level and then bring it down to the African agenda.
I would say Davos needs a greater involvement of the emerging markets' participation in shaping the agenda of the meeting. We have seen, in fairness and giving credit to the World Economic Forum, we have seen greater involvement of business and civil society and political leaders from the developing countries. But I think if we can play a greater role in shaping that agenda and shaping the discussion, you know, we do have a big role at the Summer Davos meeting in China and also at the Africa Summit. So I'd like to see that certainly. I'd like to see South African business leaders going to Davos with a very clear, coherent message, and I think Brand South Africa has, you know, collocated a message together for all of us. But I think, yeah, that's our key objective.
Yeah. Let me come to you, Miller, because he has prompted it. What message are you taking to Davos?
Well, Godfrey, one of the key issues where we focus on is the fact that on the continent and even in our country, there's a new story that's being written. And this is a story around development. It's a story about you know, potential growth in many parts of the country. And from us as South Africa, we are saying we as a leading economy on the continent have a critical role to play in ensuring that there is inclusive growth in the continent, but we also have an incredible role to play in terms of ensuring more resilience in our economies, especially the economies in our region, because we are one of the, you know, the biggest economies in the region. So that is one of the things we are saying, and we are also saying, secondly, that you know, South Africa is not only a leading economy, but it is also a global player and a global citizen. It plays an important role in terms of you know, global governance institutions and the frameworks, such as whether it's in the United Nations or in the G20. And it is for that reason, therefore, that we are saying, you know, it is a matter of the theme that we're talking about speaks to how we as a country raises the interest of the continent or the emerging markets. So we don't purport to speak on behalf of them, but we should raise the issues that are of interest to you know, emerging markets, but also for us, for the continent. So driving the African agenda is a critical element of the message we are taking.
Yeah.
And lastly, we are saying, as part of the story that we are writing in this country, is that we have a plan to deal with the current environment. I think resilient dynamism talks about a bold vision and action.
Yeah.
And we are saying we have a vision. We have a vision 2030 that we are taking out there. We have a plan around infrastructure, which will hopefully contribute to economic growth, to the creation of jobs, and in that way creating more prosperity in our region and the continent. And those are three of the elements that we are taking as part of the story we're taking to Davos.
Now, when I was preparing for this interview, I went through our newsroom and I said to the guys, I would like you to give me input into what some of the issues you think should be raised there in my debate. And one of the issues that one of the guys came up with was, you speak of resilient dynamism, and he is saying, actually he read somewhere yesterday, I think it was from a World Bank report, that there's a perception, and it may well not be supported by evidence, but there's a perception that actually the emerging markets have been far more resilient than the developed markets. And now the resilience of the developing world is being threatened by inaction from the developed markets. How fair is that question?
Well, look, I think It is true. If you look at growth since the 2008 crisis, emerging nations have done very well. In particular, of course, in Southeast Asia. But Africa has done particularly well over that period as well. Bounced back very quickly, helped by a quick bounce in commodity prices. China came back very strongly. South America did very well initially and has subsequently faded a little bit, but nevertheless hasn't done too badly.
They are still growing.
They are still growing. Brazil nearly slipped into recession last year, but managed to avoid it by crook. So, but I think a lot of these economies, of course, are export orientated.
Sure.
Their traditional markets are typically Europe and the United States. And clearly, if your major trading partner is in recession, as Europe is at the moment, it actually makes it very difficult to sustain over a long period of time. So I think it is fair to say that the sustainability of these economies are threatened to some degree.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a lot of our neighbors are much more focused on China, and China's resilience has been there. South Africa is in a slightly different position. Obviously, a lot of our manufactured goods exports do end up in Europe in particular, and consequently we've been a little bit more negatively affected by what's gone on.
Let's take the conversation into the individual agendas of the region. Let me begin with Cape Town, and let's go to Dr. Sewe. If I can start with you, one of the lines that I saw on the WEF agenda about Africa is around how to ensure that protectionism and nationalism do not derail regional economic integration and multilateral cooperation. Now, this applies for the other regions as well. That's Asia, the Americas, as I said, and Africa as well. When you look at it, how big a threat do you think nationalism, particularly the whole issue around resource nationalism? We've seen that debate coming up several times. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, we've seen it here in South Africa, we've seen it in various guises in other parts, including Nigeria.
Godfrey, you know, it's a very sensitive and topical discussion, resource nationalization, and there's been a lot written and spoken about it. But my personal view is that, you know, for many, many decades, the continent has seen a lot of its raw materials and a lot of its equity, a lot of its value being exported without there being any a return in value. So I think we've got to find the right balance. We've got to find the balance whereby, you know, African governments have the right to retain a significant portion of the wealth that's on the continent in order to invest in the development of the continent.
Can we afford to, though,
also make sure that the opportunity remains attractive for foreign investors at the same time?
That's exactly the point I was going to make, that we don't have the capital, we don't have the skills, and yet at the same time we want a larger share of the pie. Can we afford to make these demands?
I think we can. I think firstly we should always start on the basis that what is right and what is necessary for our continent's development. And then secondly, we should find the capital solutions to that. Africa has a large amount of its own capital. A lot of it has been exported. I'm talking about capital now, not resources.
Right.
I think it's important for Africans to bring the capital back into the continent. But at the end of the day, you know, it's got to be a win-win. Business has to enter into partnership with governments to find solutions which benefit both business and which benefit you know, the populations in Africa. We cannot have decades whereby Africans do not benefit from their own wealth and resources.
Mila, let me come to you. How difficult is it to sell this message that we need balance in the relationship between capital and the people and the governments that are in Africa, particularly given, as I said, the issues that we will have to deal with, the lack of capital, the lack of skills, and yet at the same time now we have these real threats of social instability because of these other inequalities?
Well, Godfrey, I think one of the key things that both governments and I believe corporations have recognized is the fact that we're living in a very interconnected world, and therefore a lot of interdependencies, and therefore it is important that we co-create solutions that will ensure our survival.
Yeah.
Hence, the issue of resilience is also about saying it's not business as usual. How else can we ensure that, for instance, we capture some of the value that out of the continent, for instance, we've been exporting in terms of raw materials, and that is why, as I said, for South Africa, we believe that plans and policies such as the National Development Plan, our Industrial Policy Action Plan, are aimed at precisely doing that, ensuring that there's greater beneficiation of our resources, so such that we can capture some of the value to create a better life for our people.
Do we reset, or do we reform, or do we go revolution?
Look, it all depends on various stages. I mean, if you talk of the continent as well, it's important to recognize that you're talking about 54 different countries. But what is imperative is that there is a need for transformation. There is a need to ensure that there is more balance, and there cannot only be a focus on one element. And I think it's the whole holistic way of looking at things, where looking at in terms of our impacts on the environment, looking at people, and at the same time looking at profits. So that's why I agree with Iqbal when he says it's a question of balance, and I think that balance can be found. Increasingly, corporations themselves are finding that they have to make a contribution in the communities, in the territories where they actually extract profits. And I think that is the perspective that one needs to take of that.
Yeah, I remember last year's summit in Davos, one of the issues that they were dealing with was the whole issue of whether capitalism has failed, and if there was a need indeed to go back to the drawing board and really look at a totally different system of running the global economy. But now that conversation is evolving, and we now seem to be moving forward and saying, actually, we do not need to completely revolutionize. We need to perhaps just look at the system and see if we can fix it. Dennis, do investors understand the new reality that there are greater demands for a greater share and fair share of our resources?
No, I think they do to a large extent. I mean, just on the capitalism issue, capitalism fails every couple of decades. But the point about the system is it bounces back with greater resilience.
So it is sustainable.
It is a sustainable, it's the only system which basically repairs itself, almost like a body that heals itself. You know, I think that has to be appreciated. I think the other important thing to realize with resource nationalism is that it happens every few decades as well. This isn't a new phenomenon. There's a cycle which is actually well documented in the literature, and that is when you have commodity price booms. At the end of each commodity price boom, governments start to moan about not having enough of the share of the pie. They then, depending on the country, seize more of the share of the pie, either through higher taxes or through nationalization. And normally that's exactly the time that commodity prices start falling.
A little bit like the time when stock markets start going down because the retail investors are coming in.
And so they absorb these assets at inflated prices if they bother to actually compensate the private sector investors.
Are you warning the government here that perhaps this is not the way to go? Really?
It's a very dangerous one because, as I say, it's very well documented in the literature. Then what happens is, of course, governments are actually even worse than private sector companies that invest in, and particularly in resources. You get to the bottom of the commodity cycle, there's no investment that goes into it, mines are collapsing, and then they sell it to private sector investors once again.
Cheaply.
Cheaply, who then make a bomb out of the asset by rejuvenating. So it is so predictable.
So
we're not talking about
solution,
anything new.
So what is the solution?
I think governments really have to realize that mining is a long-term investment, that it goes through very, very shaky cycles, that just because the last few years have actually been very profitable for mining, it doesn't mean that the next 5 years is going to be profitable for mining. So you've got to come up with some sort of formula which gives long-term investors long-term assurance that you're not going to, every now and again when things look great, you go in and you take more of the pie, and then when things go badly, the investors actually flee because they basically just can't actually absorb those sort of taxes and high costs. So I think it's very good to actually talk about some sort of win-win situation between governments, but it has to be a long-term solution that recognizes that there are very, very definite cycles in resources. Otherwise, we will, in a few years' time, when all the excitement has died down about resources, be left with big holes in the ground and governments that can't actually afford to keep those mines going.
Absolutely.
which we've seen, unfortunately, with a lot of regulatory in Africa as well as in, of course, South America.
Some of the governments, of course, want to fail first before they actually stop from doing it themselves. But another threat that is emerging in Africa, and it's not sitting at Davos, is the whole issue of security. Miller. And I know this one is a particularly difficult one for you, because now you have to sell the story to investors that we are a stable continent, we are a stable democracy in South Africa. But at the same time, when you see events like Mali, and now the French having to come and rescue us, if you like, you see stories like Algeria, you see the instability in parts of the continent, including Somalia, which has been a sore in Africa for so many years. It becomes increasingly difficult, and yet this is not sitting at Davos. Should it have been?
Well, Godfrey, if you think about it, the issue of risk and looked at broadly would cover issues such as questions of instability and how economies and companies are going to react or respond to those to ensure their long-term survival. Yeah. So I think that while it might not be sitting apparently in the process of discussing dynamism and resilience, which is essentially around risk, these issues will come up. But to your specific question around what is happening on the continent, I think for one needs to also look at perspective. You know, if we were sitting here 10 years, 15 years ago, talking about the issue of stability on the continent, we might have been telling a different story, because we'd probably count on our hands the number of democracies and stable economies on the continent. That has changed significantly. So what is important is how we deal with issues of instability. And you will see that there are various countries such as South Africa which play a critical role in conflict resolution, in ensuring stability on the continent, because we understand the interconnectedness and dependencies that we have to have a stable continent if we as well as a country are to survive. And I think that is the kind of ethos that's coming through of multilateralism, of pluralism, and understanding that it's an interconnected world in which we live, and that we all have to make sure that there is stability. So for an example, you will see the kinds of actions that have been taken over the past years by South Africa to ensure they contribute to peacekeeping, to stability on the continent. So we are saying that times have changed. There's a time when, for an example, member states within the AU would have acted unilaterally in particular ways, but now people understand that they have to act within a framework and a governance framework that is predicated on rule of law and on ensuring respect for sovereignty of other countries, but not being clouded to actions that may result in instability regionally. So we are talking here at a different juncture altogether. Although we are not saying there are no challenges, this is a different juncture. How we deal with these issues as Africans has evolved quite significantly from 10 years or so ago.
Absolutely, because from 10 years ago we'd have been talking about many coups, which we are no longer talking about to a large degree. So I was reading one day this paper by Dr. Jacqueline Chimanzi, and she's at the Industrial Development Corporation. It was an interesting paper because in it she spoke about how Africa has changed, the perception around Africa has changed, and how we have seen growth across the African continent. You know, the figure that we often talk about, the 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African, etc. But she then asked another question. To what extent has the growth that we've been seeing been a result of African actions more than it has been reaction and action because of action taken by others out of Africa, such as China? I'm throwing that question to you, Dr. Seve.
Yeah, I think that I'm always amused rather than amazed by how people always claim credit for Africans' growth outside of the continent. Let's look at the reality. Africans are highly entrepreneurial. We're dealing with an increasingly educated, highly literate grouping of young people. And the Africans I've met in various business, in various institutions over the last couple of years show me that Africans themselves are driving the agenda when it comes to technology, communication, infrastructure. So I would say this is really, and this is, by the way, what's very different, and I think what people have just not understood is that Africans are beginning to take their destiny into their own hands and recognizing it in a very positive way. Whether it comes to issues such as resource nationalization, the macro factor in resources is the fact that the world is growing, resources are limited, and it's being recognized even in Africa that Africans can benefit from that demand and supply equation. Africans are taking the responsibility in security, and Africans are taking the responsibility in ensuring that the continent thrives agriculturally, it thrives in business, etc. It's a very different Africa. I think that for anyone to even suggest otherwise, I mean, I read an article just recently whereby Oxfam are having great difficulty in presenting their sort of perspective on the continent, which they've done for decades, as a continent ravaged by diseases and by corruption and by coup d'etats, you know, as one that, hey, hold on, Africans are beginning to do something for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, if we can somehow or another open the window to the world to see what Africans, whether they're in Nigeria, Tanzania, Libya, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, are beginning to do, especially young South Africans, you know. Sometimes we are caught in a mindset of the past, where we try and look at Africa through lenses that are very are shaped about 10, 20 years ago. I think we need a new lens to look at Africa, and I hope that the African delegation to Davos this year is going to convince people to not look at the, you know, few stumbling blocks here and there, but to look at the overall direction in which the continent is going, and in particular where young people, young entrepreneurs, young professionals on the continent are driving the continent.
Thank you indeed. Let me come quickly to you guys in studio, because I just want to put it to you. He is arguing that Africa's growth is a result of actions by Africans. Yes, there are other external factors coming into play, but Africa is responsible for Africa. Your take?
No, look, we agree 100%. Is I do think that Africans are entrepreneurial, innovative, go-getting. I think one of the big obstacles over the last few decades has really actually been African governments, which have been anything but go-getting and so forth. And I think that's where we've seen big change. We've started to see governments actually putting in place reforms across a whole range of issues. And I think for me, I mean, obviously commodity prices have been a big injection of liquidity and capital, which has obviously facilitated growth, no doubt about it. But I think also the debt forgiveness that came with the HIPC initiative.
It came at the right time.
It came at the right time. It unburdened the continent from a lot of debt which was holding it back. But it also stimulated policies which then started to actually work, with the real reform agendas coming through, where countries had to actually get their act together to qualify for that.
It freed governments
to begin. It freed governments who then freed their own populations who have now taken it forward in a very dramatic way.
Mila, I think I can anticipate your answer.
No, I would agree that we've seen increasingly, you know, Africans taking charge of their own destiny. And I was going to say that if you look at, you know, regulatory reform and improving the environment of doing business, for instance, you look at a third of the countries that have really been moving in terms of making significant reforms are on the continent. That's about a significant achievement. So it shows that there is a conscious effort to really transform the economies of these countries and ensure you know, a better quality of life for their peoples. And so that is important for us to look at.
Absolutely. We need to take a break now. When we come back, we want to move the conversation onto the global stage, where we break down the global agenda that's going to be discussed at Davos. We've just done the regional agenda now. And then we're also going to look at what companies, the industry agenda, what companies need to be doing to now work effectively in this new global environment. That's after the break. Don't go away. But of course, remember, CNBC Africa is going to be having a live debate at Davos called De-risking Africa, where we're going to be talking about what needs to be done to make sure that we reduce the risk of doing business in Africa. And on that panel, we've got some great voices: President Jacob Zuma, President Goodluck Jonathan. We've got also Suni Mittal, the CEO of Bharti International, as well as Louis Abo from the International Crisis Group, plus Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man from the Dangote Group. But after the break, we're coming back to Davos.